Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to more Conversations in the Digital Age. Our show is about American nuclear policy in the post-Cold War era. President John F. Kennedy, in his inaugural address, January 20, 1961, issued a clarion call, which became the cornerstone of U.S. policy.
Finally, to those nations who would make themselves our adversary, we offer not a pledge, but a request that both sides begin anew the quest for peace. Before the dark powers of destruction, unleashed by science, engulf all humanity in planned or accidental self-destruction. But neither can two great and powerful groups of nations take comfort from our present course, both sides overburdened by the cost of modern weapons, both rightly alarmed by the steady spread of the deadly atom, yet both racing to alter that uncertain balance of terror that stays the hand of mankind's final war.
While the U.S. and the Russians have entered into no less than 8 arms control treaties since 1961, the last of which in 2010, nuclear policy is back in the foreground, with North Korea's nuclear and missile tests announced in January. How should the U.S. manage this threat from North Korea? Where are we headed with Russia on nuclear arms limitation? What should be the U.S. nuclear policy in a Trump administration? Here to discuss this issue with us is Rebecca Lissner. Rebecca is an expert in nuclear issues and national security policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Rebecca, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, before we get to North Korea, let's start with Russia.
Sure.
And Trump said that he wants to trade the relaxation of sanctions with Russia for nuclear disarmament and a lessening of nuclear arms. So what do you make of that?
Well, it's really hard to tell what exactly Donald Trump hopes to achieve as far as a nuclear arms control agreement may be concerned with the Russians. He's on the record in the past casting doubt about the worth of nuclear arms control agreements in general, and recently in December on Twitter, he said that he seeks to strengthen and expand the U.S. nuclear arsenal, something that seems to be at odds with the objective of arms control. That being said, he did say in an interview recently that he would trade sanctions relief, possibly sanctions that were imposed on Russia for the invasion of Ukraine, in exchange for a nuclear arms reduction treaty. Now, if that is a genuine commitment, I would say that that is not a good idea. Those sanctions exist precisely because Russia took action that contravened the norms of the international order that exists that, protects the sovereignty of states like Ukraine. And to link that to nuclear arms control agreements, the provisions of which are completely unclear, would not be the right approach.
And even if it were the right approach, would it have been good tactically to say right up front, we're going to trade one against the other? This is before he has his team in place, before he's even taken office.
It certainly doesn't seem so, and it speaks to this broader question about what the Trump administration's Russia policy will be, given what has emerged to be a very significant divergence between the rhetoric that we've heard from President-elect, soon-to-be President Trump, and from his key national security team, for example, in their Senate confirmation hearings, where nearly all of his key foreign policy advisors have said they support a more aggressive approach to Russia than Trump himself has advocated.
Now, is it important to have a grand strategy with regard to nuclear proliferation and nuclear disarmament?
I certainly think so. I mean, stopping the spread of nuclear weapons has been one of the key tenets of American grand strategy, not just since the end of the Cold War, but actually throughout the Cold War as well. And people often think of the desire to stem nuclear proliferation as something that's more of a, 1990s, 2000s, more sort of that modern phenomenon. But in fact, if you look at the origins, for example, of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in the Johnson administration, that was actually a pretty radical step whereby the United States collaborated with the Soviet Union in order to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, including to some of our allies. So trying to limit the spread of nuclear weapons has been a long-standing goal of U.S. policy and is really a central pillar of American grand strategy.
Now, you've written recently that Trump appears to focus on short-term tactical wins.
That's right.
What's wrong with a strategy of short-term tactical wins? The whole may be even greater than the sum of the parts.
Right. Well, I don't actually think so. So I think it's very important for countries like the United States and political leaders like Donald Trump to have what academics refer to as a grand strategy. And what that basically means is a coherent theory of national security that makes prioritization and makes trade-offs in order to balance the means available for foreign policy with the ends that are sought. And what Donald Trump seems to have done and will likely do in office is prioritize an approach that I have called tactical transactionalism. And what that means, like you said, is that he pursues these quick wins rather than pursuing a grander strategy. And in so doing, seems to overlook the multidimensional nature of foreign policy, thereby potentially sacrificing the national interest in favor of things, that look good on Twitter but might not actually serve broader goals.
Well, I think you've said in the past that, and it's very interesting, that winning deals overrides fundamental strategic objectives like deterring adversaries, assuring regional stability, and preventing nuclear proliferation. But Trump relishes being unpredictable. Keep him guessing. Do you think that's smart?
Well, I think it's important to remember unpredictability or surprise is a tactic. It's not a strategy. So there are certainly good tactical uses for unpredictability. And you could imagine in a negotiation where you might get a better deal if your counterparty doesn't know exactly what you're thinking or what exactly you're going to do. But in foreign policy writ large, unpredictability is not a strategy, and in fact it can actually be to the detriment of the United States if our allies, for example, don't know that we will credibly come to their defense. For example, one of the ways in which Trump has said he may be unpredictable is in his willingness to uphold our commitment to NATO. I would argue that inserting an element of unpredictability into that alliance is not a good thing. It's not tactically useful and it's not strategically useful.
In a recent piece that you wrote in Foreign Policy, you said Trump is going to regret not having a grand strategy. You said that his policies are devoid of ethical or moral considerations. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think one thing that has really characterized the Obama administration's approach is this idea that I think, in the words of Vice President Biden, we're great because we're good. The idea that there are certain moral qualities and values that are central to the United States and that actually generate a source of soft power in our dealings with the world. Donald Trump doesn't seem to buy that. And one example would be his past advocacy of the return to waterboarding or the pursuit of the families of terrorists. These are abandonments of certain types of values and commitments that the United States has previously upheld in our counterterrorism policy and ones that he doesn't think carry much weight on their own.
Well, you've characterized his strategies as more bilateral than multidimensional. I mean, what's so great about multidimensional, and why do we need it?
Right. Well, that gets back to the central issue about, how do we have a grand strategy? How can a presidential administration take a holistic look at all the different inputs into U.S. foreign policy, both in terms of what we're trying to achieve and what are the resources at our disposal, and how can a president balance those things? And the problem with viewing problems only bilaterally is that it doesn't allow space for accounting for the trade-offs and interrelationships between issues. So, for example, one of the ways ways in which Donald Trump has advocated highly transactional ideas is when it comes to our traditional treaty allies, like, for example, Japan and South Korea. And he thinks that because those are wealthy countries, they should be paying the costs of their own defense, and he thinks this is a raw deal for the United States. Even when presented with evidence that, in fact, both of those countries contribute a substantial amount, it would probably be more expensive for us to return our troops, for example, from South Korea to the United States mainland. But that being the case, in looking at both of those alliances as bilateral deals, he fails to appreciate the broader strategic context and the broader security context in the Asia-Pacific region, and the way in which both of those alliances actually serve much broader purposes than the sort of pure kind of real estate deal type approach would suggest.
Well, if we were to withdraw our troops from Korea, or even not necessarily to continental United States, but even to the south, what do you suppose the North Koreans and the Chinese would do?
Well, certainly the forward deployment of U.S. troops to Korea has been an important element of our deterrent in Asia for quite a long time. And given the context of increasing insecurity on the Korean Peninsula and greater tension between the North and the South, and the North's provocations more broadly, it certainly does not seem the right time to be withdrawing U.S. troops from the peninsula.
Nuclear issues are back in the news with North Korea because of the 2 nuclear tests in 2016 and the 24 ballistic missile launches. Obama's Deputy Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said that the North Korean tests were of unprecedented intensity, with the threat growing by the day. What do you make of all this?
Well, I think it's an extremely concerning situation, and certainly the most imminent and consequential national security issue that Donald Trump will have to face when he takes office on January 20th. There have been reports recently that North Korea is preparing to test an intercontinental ballistic missile. And of course, that is the threshold that both Trump and the outgoing administration have set as being absolutely intolerable. Because once North Korea has an intercontinental ballistic missile and the ability to miniaturize a nuclear warhead to put on that missile, it then increasingly will have the capability to hit the continental United States, which of course is a very concerning situation.
They said that Trump's first national security briefing, an intelligence briefing, was on North Korea, so he's clearly concerned about it.
He's clearly concerned about it, and he did tweet that he would never allow North Korea to obtain an ICBM. Of course, nobody wants North Korea, nobody in the United States wants North Korea to obtain an ICBM, and so the question, of course, is, how do you accomplish that?
Well, he said it won't happen, but he thinks the way to accomplish it is to make China have them disarm or stand back. How do you make China cause the North Koreans to stand back? Why would they ever do it?
Right. Well, it's a key challenge, but I think it's important to remember that, China doesn't want a crisis on the Korean Peninsula because it shares a border with North Korea and is concerned about what kind of spillover effects could happen, on Chinese territory and the way that could potentially destabilize the Chinese Communist Party if there were to be a crisis on the peninsula. So they do have their own interest in stability and in trying to rein in the provocations of the North Korean regime. That being said, to date, they certainly haven't done enough. And so the key challenge that the Obama administration has confronted and that the Trump administration will confront is, how do you get China to do more? One recent step that the Obama administration took was in deploying theater missile capabilities to South Korea, which was something that China really did not like, but maybe the kind of thing that really increases pressure in such a way that China will be motivated to take stronger action to try and rein in their North Korean client.
Well, one thing Trump has done is he's talked down the dollar 1.5% in a week, and which of course makes Chinese goods more expensive if we import them. He's also threatened to impose a protective tariff as high as 35% on Chinese goods, made our exports to China less profitable. Is this going to bring pressure on China?
Well, I think the important thing is to view the North Korean issue within the context of the broader U.S.-China relationship. And this is one of the reasons why, for example, the threatening of a trade war with China, why the calling into question of the one China policy with regards to Taiwan doesn't seem to make sense right now, if it ever does, because we need China's help in dealing with North Korea. And so what Donald Trump has done is injected a great deal of uncertainty, instability, and friction into many different elements of the U.S.-China relationship, when in fact we should really be focusing on this #1 threat of North Korea.
But of course, Obama had 8 years without the trade war and without the threat to recognize Taiwan, and North Korea continued to build missiles and a nuclear arsenal, and China stood by and watched it happen.
I think that's right. This is a threat that has been growing on the watch of the George W. Bush administration, of course, which is when North Korea first acquired nuclear weapons. It's a threat that, has been growing, in the Clinton administration, and of course also in the Obama administration. So this is a long-term threat, and it's one that, none of these post-Cold War administrations has been able to sufficiently counter.
Now, we've sanctioned North Korea heavily, and we're continuing to sanction North Korea. Do you think sanctions work?
Well, I think if you look at the Iranian experience, that certainly provides a template for the way sanctions can work. If you have a strong international coalition that is able to cobble together a really strict sanctions regime and to enforce it vigorously. In the case of North Korea, what's been lacking is the type of airtight sanctions regime and enforcement, particularly as it relates to China, that can really put pressure on the regime and potentially change their decision calculus.
We've also deployed the THAAD defense system to assist Korea, the Republic of Korea, and to assist Japan in the event of some hostile moves by North Korea. That threw the Chinese into a tailspin, and they lashed out against us as a result of that. Do you think the THAAD defense system can be useful in this whole equation?
Yes, absolutely. That kind of theater missile defense system, which really increased some pressure on China, which believes that the THAAD system also has utility against their military capabilities, is the kind of move that shows the United States is really serious about needing Chinese cooperation on this threat and is willing to take measures that make China uncomfortable in order to try and protect our allies, for example, in South Korea, against the North Korean threat. So, that is certainly the type of thing which, poses a small risk of escalation, but, nevertheless communicates the message that we're serious and increases pressure in a way that seems useful.
And what about the South China Sea, over which China has asserted an increased sovereignty, almost impairing freedom of the seas? What should we do about that?
Well, I'm not an expert on maritime security issues, but I do know that there are some questions brewing about what the Trump administration's policy will be towards the South China Sea. Rex Tillerson, in his confirmation hearing to be Secretary of State, seemed to indicate that the United States would actively intervene to prevent Chinese access to what have effectively become their bases in the South China Sea. But, the United States doesn't necessarily have the authority or certainly not the sovereignty to do that kind of thing. So what seems more likely is a continuation of the kind of freedom of navigation exercises that the U.S. Navy has been conducting, and also the sort of broader deterrence regime that needs to be built up in order to try and prevent the Chinese from turning the South China Seas effectively into a lake.
Well, all these issues are interrelated, certainly, and maritime sovereignty is related to China, and it's related to North Korea indirectly, and is very important. But you touched on Iran. Trump has said when he gets, at times, when he's during the campaign, that if he gets in office, he's going to tear up the deal. Does that make any sense? And can it even be done?
It certainly does not make sense, but unfortunately it can be done. So the reason why it doesn't make sense is because without firing a single shot, the United States was able to engineer a diplomatic agreement that resulted in the extension of the Iranian breakout time, which is to say the amount of time it would take for Iran to build a nuclear weapon, from 2 to 3 months to about a year. And the key requirements of the deal will last for 10 years, and some of the requirements last for 15 years. So what we've done is meaningfully set back the Iranian nuclear program and instituted a very robust inspections regime to make sure that the deal is monitored and enforced and complied with by Tehran. So I think overall that's a win. Now, can it be disrupted by the Trump administration? It certainly can. The Iranians have already begun to complain about the imposition of sanctions on them. And, were the United States to reimpose sanctions or to otherwise unilaterally withdraw from the agreement, which is not a treaty, but is really just sort of an agreement between a number of states, the United States and Iran, certainly it is subject to reversal quickly and easily by the Trump administration.
But he would need congressional approval to reimpose sanctions or to withdraw sanctions that are in place. Senator Bob Corker, a Republican, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has said, no way. He said, we have to adhere to the deal that was made. So can Trump really do it even if he wants to?
Well, I think he can, because there are a number of executive waivers that would probably allow him to do it. But even so, Senator Corker's comments are interesting because so many Senate Republicans and congressional Republicans, were vigorously opposed to the deal when it was first struck. And yet now many of them have come to see the deal as having been a good thing. They think that it's working. So there actually is a remarkable amount of support that has grown in Washington for the deal, even though it's not perfect and even though it's not permanent. So I think Donald Trump will find it, politically difficult to reverse the deal. And also, frankly, I don't think he wants to live with the consequences of backing away from the deal.
Just reverting to North Korea, he said one of the ways out is for him to invite Kim Jong-un to the United States for a meeting. Do you think that would be helpful?
I doubt it. One of the key debates when it comes to how to deal with North Korea is, should we talk first or should we pressure first and talk later? And, the way that conversations have gone in the past and given the behavior of the North Korean regime, I think, to invite him to Washington for a dialogue with the President of the United States would be to legitimate really destabilizing North Korean behavior. And frankly, I think it's unlikely to yield any results.
So where do you see Trump heading? Is policy discernible in the area of nuclear disarmament, nuclear proliferation? What do you think he's going to do?
Well, so I think there are a few different policy areas where it'll be interesting to watch what Donald Trump and his administration do going forward. So far we've discussed North Korea, where there's this highly pressing threat, and some experts expect that, sometime in January, sometime in February, they may do this ICBM test, which will be very concerning and get them that much closer to the capability to hit the continental United States. So an early decision, probably one of his first National Security Council meetings will have to be devoted to thinking through the North Korean issue. And this gets back to the sort of multidimensional strategy question, because the North Korean issue has to be considered within the constellation of all of our security relationships in Asia, both with our allies and also with our adversaries. And then there's the Iran deal. Again, it may be to Trump's advantage to let that sit for a while. That seems increasingly likely, but he is on the record, throughout the campaign, advocating for tearing up the deal and stating that, it's one of the worst agreements ever negotiated. So those statements may come back to haunt him in some way. And then there's another issue area which we haven't discussed yet, which is U.S. nuclear weapons policy, and in particular the roughly $1 trillion nuclear modernization program, which the Obama administration has initiated. And Trump will have to decide early whether he wants to go ahead with that modernization program, whether he wants to modify it in some way, and how that might be related to the possibility of arms control efforts with Russia.
But hasn't he said he wants to ramp up our nuclear arsenal? So he's not only going to modernize, he's going to enhance and expand.
He did, right. So he said on Twitter that he wants to strengthen and expand the arsenal, and then he said, let there be an arms race. But then again, as we discussed at the beginning, he's also spoken about the possibility of arms control agreements. So there remain a number of questions about, what will nuclear modernization look like under Trump? Will it look substantially similar to the plan that has been set in motion by the Obama administration? Or, will it look much more muscular than that? And if so, what does that mean in practice?
Well, aren't our arms now, to use Kennedy's words, sufficient beyond doubt? Nuclear arms.
Yes. So
We could blow up the world if we wanted
we
to.
could blow up the world, but even so, a key goal of U.S. policy is to maintain a U.S. nuclear arsenal that is safe, secure, and effective. And so that means that our delivery systems, the warheads themselves, the command and control systems, and the nuclear infrastructure that supports the nuclear weapons complex all need to be up to date. And the truth is that a lot of these are Cold War era systems that are aging and are in need of modernization. That doesn't mean we need to build new nuclear weapons, but it does mean, for example, we have, B-52 bombers, B-62 bombers that are, from the Eisenhower administration. That kind of thing needs to be updated.
Now, as you know, Jeremy Stone died recently, and he was the father of the view that if we cut back our defense systems, and if the Soviets did likewise, there would be no incentive to launch or deploy new offensive weapons on either side. And pretty much that's become gospel in the nuclear policy community. Do you agree with that?
Nuclear arms control has proven to be quite effective in sort of attenuating, at least to some extent, the nuclear arms race. But it's important to appreciate the ways in which the current situation is slightly different than the situation that we found ourselves in during the Cold War, which is to say, increasingly, China is also an important player that has modernized its own nuclear arsenal and is, loading multiple missiles on MIRVing them. They are also deploying road mobile missiles. So all of these steps are making their nuclear arsenal much more difficult to track, to counter, et cetera, and increasing their survivability. And so ideally, the next stage of nuclear arms control would not just be bilateral between the US and Russia, but would also take into account the systems that are possessed by China as well.
Okay, unfortunately, we have to wrap up. So I have a question for you. Will nuclear policy be the first order of business in the new Trump administration?
I certainly hope so.
Rebecca Lissner, this has been just marvelous.
Thank
you
you
so much for coming by.
Pleasure.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. I'm Jim Zirin. All the best and take care.